to restrain, in the words of Mr. Webster, is to hold back from acting or advancing, either by physical or moral force or by interposing an obstacle. Restraint, then, is a process of hindering from action or motion, and restraining his patient is the first thing a veterinarian must do. Without preventing the animal's flight or attack, he is unable to examine it or treat it. He will need still more control over its movements in order to treat it, and for clean and thorough surgery, he will need to prevent his patient's movements and struggles completely. In fact, some degree of restraint of an animal's movements is involved in everything the veterinarian does, and experienced practitioners have studied this as much as any other branch of their art. Before attempting to restrain animals, one must be familiar with the handling of rope and be able to tie quickly the commonly used knots. Those which are essential in animal restraint are described here today, and a knowledge of them is basic to an understanding of the techniques of restraint. In the descriptions of the knots and restraints which follow, reference will be made to the various parts of a rope. We will now examine these. In describing the various parts of a rope, we will classify this as the end, this as the standing part of the rope. If we should double this rope in two, the loop end would be called the bight, B-I-G-H-T. And it is from these ends that we can use to describe the various portions of the rope and the various knots which we will engage on today. The simplest function of a rope, or the simplest loop, is the plain common loop. We may have an overhand knot, which is a simple intertwining of the free end. Or we may have a double overhand knot, which is taking double strands and treating it likewise. And you have a double overhand knot. A knot differs from a hitch in the fact that a hitch is used for temporary restraint only and can be loosened easily, whereas a knot is used to restrain and tie animals tight for a period of time. Let us go through some of the very basic knots that we will routinely use when restraining animals. The first knot that we should like to consider today is that of the bowline. We may have a bowline on the end, or we may have a bowline on the bight. The first knot that we will tie is a bowline on the end. And from this, if you'd hold this please, we simply can slip the rope around, thusly, tie one loop, thusly, and with the end part of the rope, go through the loop which was formed, go around the standing part, come back up, and go through the loop which is entered the first time, and then pull this tight. Now you see the real advantage to the bowline on the end. The loop will not tighten any farther, nor will it loosen any farther, and the animal is restrained quite well. The loop going through here prevents tightening up. The loop on the standing end coming from the posterior prevents it from slipping posteriorly. So here you have a bowline on the end. Let's go through the procedure one more time. From the two parts of the rope, the standing part and the end, we tie an underhand loop or throw an underhand loop in the standing part. With the end part of the rope, we go through the loop from the underneath portion, go around and under the standing part, come back up the standing part and go through the loop originally formed. This again is a bowline on the end. From this, we will go to a second method to tie a bowline on the end. We will use the same portions of the rope again, and instead of throwing just one loop, as originally was done, we will pull this section of the rope through the standing end, pass this rope, which is the end, through the loop, and pull this rope tight, and invert the end part, and you have a bowline tied in a similar fashion. Now actually, the two loops are intertwining each other similarly to what they did originally, and yet the bowline is tied in a little different fashion. Let's examine that knot again. Starting from the two parts, we form a loop, reach through the loop, and pull a free loop through it, pass the end part through the free loop, and pull on the standing part, and invert the end part, and we have a bowline on the end. From the bowline on the end, we should probably go to a bowline on the bite. Remember, originally I said that the curved end of the rope, was the bite. Now, in preparation of tying the bowline on the bite, our first step should be to tie a double overhand knot, which was described in the beginning. Let's go through a double overhand knot again. Passing the bite around the rope and pulling it through, we have a double overhand knot. Now, to convert the double overhand knot to a bowline on the bite, pass your hand through the bite, reach down and grasp the free end of your overhand knot. Let your loop fall over the top, and then pull your loop back up through the loop which was formed, and you have a bowline on the bite. As you can see, this will not slip posteriorly or anteriorly because the loop that comes from the posterior segment is intertwined thusly and cannot slip. The loop passing from the top comes and holds and intertwines this portion to where it cannot slip. Let's go through the procedure once more. The first process is a double overhand knot using your bite. Double overhand knot. You still have the bite, and after you have tied your double overhand knot, simply reach through the bite, come down and grasp the same end that you pulled up originally, drop the loop end over the top, pull up on your free loop end which was just dropped, and you have a bowline on the bite. If you will follow these techniques, you should not have difficulty in tying a bowline on the bite. It is possible to pull on the wrong rope as you drop the loop over the top, and you will tie a slip knot rather than a bowline on the bite. We will not go into that. I would rather that you would learn the right way only. The next knot we would like to examine is the knot that is used frequently to tie the front legs of an animal once this animal is cast. And there is a variation of the knot, which we will get into in just a moment. The first knot that I would like to examine is a clove hitch. And a clove hitch can be tied simply by inverting one's hand and grasping the other portion of the hand thusly. Then by simple rotation of both ends and by inverting one loop and superimposing it on the other, we have a clove hitch. Let's go through the technique again. By inverting one hand, left or right, you grasp the rope thusly with palm up. With the other hand, grasp the rope with palm up also. Then by simple inversion of the two knots and by superimposing the two loops one upon the other, you have a clove hitch. A clove hitch can be used in restraining an animal by putting one clove hitch here, and immediately on the other front leg, one can tie another clove hitch a short distance apart. Now this is particularly important on bulls where you do not want to have the front feet completely tied together, because if you do with a thick-chested bull, if you have both of the front legs tied very closely together, you can certainly get a radial or a brachial paralysis. This knot works very effectively, and as you can see, if the leg is inserted in this manner and you are pulling on this loop and you're pulling on this loop, the only thing that the clove hitch will do is tighten down, but it won't slip back and forth. Rarely will a clove hitch come loose of an animal's leg. Now from a variation of the clove hitch, we can very easily go into restraint of the front legs of a horse by using a similar hitch and a modification of the clove hitch. Again, if we would take our two hands, turn one hand, palm up, invert it. The other hand, palm up, straight forward. Again, invert the two loops as we did with the clove hitch. Now, if you will remember, in a clove hitch, we simply inverted the two ropes thusly. By turning the loops thusly and inverting them and placing them on each other. This is the clove hitch. For the tomfool's knot, you continue to form this clove hitch, and once you get the knots in this position, or the two loops in this position, reach through the two open sections of your clove hitch, one this way and the other from this way, and pull the two loops through. And here you have a tomfool's knot. Now a tomfool's knot is used on the front leg of horses. You can put one foot in this leg and the other foot in this leg, then pull the two end parts, and you have the animal restrained very well. Let's go through the knot one more time. Again, starting with an inverted hand in one direction, hand straight out in the other direction, both of them with the palms upward. Turn your palms and your loops toward each other, and again we have the two loops rolled together in a clove hitch. If we will go through these two loops of the clove hitch, pick up one rope here, pick the other rope up here, pull them through onto each other, and we have a tomfool's knot. Now the second loop that we would like to describe, second hitch, is that of a butterfly. A butterfly is very similar to a tomfool's, except it does not have as many ropes moving and having friction against each other. We still start the loops the same direction as we did the original clove hitch. In other words, turn one hand upward, palm up, invert the hand. The other hand we will put in front of us, palm up again. Form our two loops by inversion of the rope, similar to what we did with the clove hitch. And this time, instead of forming a complete clove hitch by inverting and placing the two loops one on the other, we will slide the two loops outside each other. A clove hitch is like this, as you can see. In the process of making a butterfly, we do not superimpose these two loops. Rather, one loop stays on the outside of the other loop. And the process of pulling the two ropes through is exactly the same. Reach through the open loop here, pull the rope through, and from the back we can reach through and pull the open loop through here, and we have the butterfly. Notice that we have only a simple knot in the butterfly. Let's tie the butterfly one more time. Again, we start just like we did with the clove hitch. Start the loops together, but instead of superimposing the loops one inside the other, like we did previously, we pull the loops to the outside. And from here, it is a simple procedure of tying the butterfly. We have a simple knot on itself. Now let's compare it to the tomfool's knot. The tomfool's knot started again with the beginning of the clove hitch. The two loops were superimposed on the other, and then we reached through and got the open loops. Notice in the tomfool's there is a compound knot or a double knot. And occasionally this double knot, when it gets wet, can be a little difficult to take off an animal. Let's go through a restraint procedure as far as tying an animal by halter to a stationary object. There are several ways which are possible, and we will discuss them today. The first way is by a simple slip knot, and if our animal is tied on to our standing part and we're tying the animal to a stationary project, simply turn the rope around like this, feeding the end part around the standing part, and you have a common slip knot. This has the decided disadvantage of if an animal pulls very snugly, very tightly on the standing part or on the halter, the knot tightens up very severely, and in the process of tightening up, it is very difficult to remove. And if an animal does fall down and is unable to get up again, many times you wind up cutting the rope before the animal is allowed to free itself. Another way of restraint to an object is by, again, tying a bowline. Very easy to do. Simply tie your knot, put your end part through the loop, go around the top of the standing part and back through the loop, and you have the animal well restrained to the object. This has the advantage of not being pulled up snugly against the object. However, if the animal does decide to move away from the object and is fighting severely, it is very difficult to get the bowline removed. One modification of this can be with a simple procedure. Again, we have the bowline. Instead of completing the part by putting the end part through the initial loop, form another loop and put it through the initial loop of your bowline, and then pull it tight. Then if the animal does decide to fight quite severely, one can simply pull on the end part, loosen the knot, and the animal can wriggle free. You still have the disadvantage of, with the bowline, once you get the first part untied, this rope can pull up snugly against this object and be very difficult to remove. So let's examine another part or another technique of restraint. If you take the rope, again, to your object, you can start exactly like you would begin to tie a bowline, and instead of putting the rope through the loop to begin with, bring the end part over the top of your loop which was formed. Then bring it back up through the initial loop, and with the loop that you have just brought up, come back through this loop again. Let's examine this a little more carefully. Start it just like you were starting to tie a bowline, and instead of moving the end part through the loop, pass the end part over the initial loop formed, bring a loop up through the initial loop, and then come back down through the loop which is formed on your bowline part. Then pull it tight like this. This has the advantage of, if an animal does decide to pull back, the entire knot will not pull up next to the object. The animal will not get loose. And yet, if you need to get this animal freed quickly, you simply can pull up on the end part which was fed through, and immediately the animal is freed. And this is a very, very satisfactory knot. Let's go over it one more time. Start as if you were tying a bowline on the end part, forming an underhand loop, passing the rope over the top, and with the end part come up through your first loop and feeding it back down again. Then pull it tight. Here you have a very satisfactory means for restraint. The animal will not get loose on you, and your knot is always easy to untie. Simply by pulling the end part, and the animal is freed. Another method which can be used for restraint of an animal to an object is by what is commonly called a wild cow tie. And this wild cow tie is simply taking this rope, and if you'd put more tension on there, please. Thank you. And you'll have to hold that. If an animal is fighting quite severely against you, pass the part thusly, and with a great amount of effort, pull on this part, and it will form a loop over thusly. And from this you can tie a half hitch into this area, and the animal can no longer pull this loop next to your object. Let's go over that one more time. Again, if an animal is pulling quite severely on the halter, you can pass the loop around this portion, pull up on this portion, twist the rope around, and then tie a simple half hitch into the end part, and this will not go up to the object any farther. The animal is well restrained, and it will not slip on you. When you decide to turn the animal loose, simply by pulling the end part, she is free, and usually this end will flip out on its own. Another method of restraining an animal to an object is by 2 half hitches. 1 half hitch can be taken this way, and then another half hitch applied right on top of it. If one desires you can put a half hitch one direction, and instead of putting the end part through and completing the half hitch, you can throw a loop through and have a double half hitch, thusly, and the animal can be released rather quickly by pulling the loop which is through. You can also restrain an animal to an object by the use of a clove hitch. And we will not go into this. You have already been showed a clove hitch. Occasionally, one is called upon to form a Hondu, and it is necessary that at least you have the basic knowledge of a Hondu. We will form a Hondu and a rope now simply by taking a single overhand knot, and from the end portion of this knot, again passing the end part back and through the loop which is coming from the posterior, and then pulling on that loop which is coming from the posterior. Let's examine this again in a little bigger figure. First, tie a simple overhand knot, thusly, and in the completion of forming the Hondu, pass the free end under the standing part coming from the posterior. After you have done this completion, pass it under the rope coming from the posterior. Simply pull the rope coming from the posterior tight, and it will form tight around your Hondu and give you a good Hondu. This can be tied from either side, either a left-hand Hondu or a right-hand Hondu. It makes no difference which way you tie it. The technique is still the same. You're all familiar with the square knot. To complete a square knot, we need two ends. If you are tying a square knot, it is a simple matter to complete the square like this, forming one overhand knot, and if your loop comes from the underneath section, pass it again to the underneath section of the opposite rope, and you will always form a square. One modification of the square knot, which can be used to rather good advantage, is in the completion of the square, instead of passing both ends around each other, pass one end as the loop end and then complete the square. This would be called a reefer's knot. And the advantage of a reefer's knot over a square knot is that a square knot you must pull both ends loose. With a reefer's knot you can simply pull the free end, which was double back as a loop, and your knot is completely untied. These are the basic knots that one must learn to tie in order for proficiency at restraint of animals. I think it behooves you to practice on these knots, because without proper restraint, you do not have adequate immobilization. You cannot have good cleansing. And without adequate mobilization and thorough cleansing of an area, practically anything you do will be done on a 50% basis. Restraint is necessary for good diagnosis. Restraint is absolutely necessary for good surgical technique. If you plan to be a good diagnostician, if you plan to be a good surgeon, If you plan to be a good veterinarian, it is a must that you practice adequate restraint. Adequate restraint necessitates a good and thorough knowledge and ability to apply these.